Welcome back to Middlesex Moments, coming to you from Middlesex Community College. I'm Steve Minkler, and I'm joined in studio with my guest, Dr. Joe Murfin, who is a professor of mathematics and music here at the college. How are you doing, Joe?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
Appreciate you having me on.
I'm glad you could be here. You know, under the Time Flies department, how long have you been at Middlesex Community College?
This is my 5th year now, and you're right, it doesn't feel like it's been that long, but the semesters seem to go by very quickly. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you teach both mathematics and music. How did that come about in your educational journey?
That's right. I kind of have a background in both. I was studying both math and music in my undergrad, and then kind of decided to go the math route for a little while after that, and did a master's in mathematics, and then came back to the music after that and did a master's in music and eventually a DMA in percussion performance. So I've kind of been going back and forth, but I've always been interested in both, and kind of along the way I've been teaching both and doing a lot of performing in the music, but also teaching math while I was doing my music degree. So I've always had an interest in both and kind of just never really decided to take one over the other.
Well, and hopefully you don't have to make that decision. You can continue to do both, right?
Right. And then of course my full-time load is in the math department, but then I usually teach about one class a semester in the music department as well.
Okay. And you also play in a few different bands and ensembles in your spare time as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Not as much now that I have a 2-year-old daughter, but I'm still playing a little bit. Actually, I have a gig this weekend down in Delaware. We're doing a Joni Mitchell tribute show.
Oh, cool.
So we've been preparing for that. It's a pretty fun show, so I'm definitely looking forward to that.
Nice. And of course, you're a member of the Middlesex Community College house band, the Square Roots.
The Square Roots, as are you.
Right? That's right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and we are known principally for our performances at the student poetry readings and the annual graduation party for our staff. Right?
That's right, yeah. I'd like to think that we do a pretty good job of rocking the house whenever we play.
I think we do. So is there some sort of connection in the brain between music and mathematics? There seems to be some logical connections. What have you found to be true?
I think intuitively people like to think that there is. I know a lot of mathematicians that are musicians as well, but I also know a lot of musicians who are really bad at math. So I'm not sure if the connection is necessarily there, but there are certainly some composers who, especially in the 20th century, they tried to connect a lot of mathematical concepts with musical concepts. So there is definitely a connection there in terms of the way music works. I'm not sure necessarily that musicians are always thinking mathematically when they're playing, but it certainly helps whenever you're figuring out things like complicated rhythms or the way sound frequencies work and all of those kinds of characteristics of music.
Sure. And certainly there's a connection with mathematics and audio engineering and, ways that's, like you were suggesting, frequencies and the way that signals work if you were in the recording industry and things of that nature.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a little out of my wheelhouse, but I know there's definitely a lot of physics that goes along with it. And so, of course, understanding the math is helpful as well.
Okay. Now, what kinds of math courses do you teach at Middlesex Community College?
I teach a pretty big variety of math courses, basically anything down from the developmental level, so a lot of the remedial maths up through the calculus sequence. So I'm kind of all over the place and in between some statistics and pre-calculus and college algebra.
Do you have a favorite class that you like to teach?
I really like teaching the first calculus class. I think that's a really interesting class to teach. It's one of the first math classes where you kind of can take everything you've learned from your trigonometry and your algebra and kind of finally put it together into one big picture and understand some of the how some of those concepts work together and solve some really interesting problems with them as well. And I think a lot of times students see that for the first time, so it kind of clicks in their head, and it's always really, really fun to see students kind of put everything together and notice that they can solve these really complicated problems with all of the stuff they've been working on the last couple of years.
Okay. Some of the classes you teach online, and how have you found that to be different from teaching students face-to-face in a traditional classroom?
It's definitely different. The hardest part about teaching online is making sure that the students who are online have the same quality of experience, especially when it comes to, for example, the fact that they don't have in-person lectures. So a lot of it is being really innovative with the ways that you deliver that information. So, for example, I teach an online music appreciation class, and for that I actually create not only PowerPoint slides, but on the slides I record basically an audio lecture on top, so the students can watch the slides and listen to me talk and explain the different concepts, and then I embed YouTube videos with different listening examples. So I'll ask them to listen to different things and tell them some things to pick out, that's seemed to have worked pretty well so far. For the math classes, we kind of use a similar technique. We have a nice homework delivery system that also doubles as a way for us to put online lectures, videos online, and the students have a workbook that they follow along with as well. So that's been really successful as well.
So you're trying to give them as much as possible a similar experience as if they were sitting in a classroom.
Exactly. And then we have also a good means for the students to communicate back and forth when they have questions, and we have discussion boards and other ways that they interact with each other and with the professor.
Okay. When you put instructional materials online, or even actually sometimes if you're using them in the classroom and you're referring students to a computer site, I know one of the big trends at the college, particularly in the math department, is something called open educational resources.
That's right.
Maybe you could tell our listeners a little bit about what OER is.
Sure. So we've been slowly adopting a lot of open educational resources, or we call them open source as well. That's another term for it. They're basically resources like textbooks, or we have an open source online homework platform as well that are essentially licensed to be free. So, for example, the textbook that we use in our lower level algebra classes it's a free textbook that basically anybody can edit. And so the Connecticut system, we worked with Housatonic Community College to edit a workbook for our intermediate algebra class that works with the type of outcomes that we need the students to have in Connecticut. And then we've slowly been expanding that. We've expanded it to our developmental classes and also to our statistics class. And then right now I'm piloting an open source course with the college algebra class online as well. So we're slowly adding those in. The nice thing, of course, is that they're much cheaper for the students to use. Even if they do buy a textbook, it's typically at cost because there's no cost going to the publisher, no money going to the publisher. It's basically just paying for the printing of the book and then a little bit for the bookstore.
What's the approximate cost difference between a traditional book and an OER material?
So a traditional math textbook, if you're talking about something that's a calculus book, they can be quite expensive, in the $200, sometimes into the $300 range. So they can get quite pricey. They're designed to be used for 2 or 3 courses usually, so that's usually the justification. But even a lower level book like an algebra book would be well over $100. So our intermediate algebra open source textbook I think cost around $30 if I'm remembering correctly. So it's definitely a significant savings.
And that's fantastic. And I know many of our students struggle with trying to put together the money to even come to college, never mind pay the extra cost of books and transportation. So have you seen any change in students being able to complete their assignments on time because their instructional materials are so much cheaper?
Well, that's the other nice thing about the open source material is that even if you don't have the physical book, for example, maybe you're waiting a couple of weeks to get your financial aid, the material is available online for free. So if anything, from day one, they can always link to the text online, and they have exactly online what they would normally have in a physical copy as well. So it's nice for the online students because some of them prefer the digital copy of the book. So if they're fine using the digital version, they might not even need to buy the hard copy. It just kind of depends on their preference.
Right. So that's fantastic. So from day one, they've got access to the material. So that's terrific.
Right. There's no excuses anymore, right?
Right. Yeah. Joe, one of the things, you've been with us for 5 years and have taught both mathematics and music, and I can tell, having been the college's dean and now CEO, that you have quite a following among students. And I'm just wondering, maybe to help our listeners understand how you, as a professor, go about your business in treating students and how you really can connect with them on a level that is respectful and professional, but also encourages them to do their best in the classroom.
Well, I'm really happy to hear that. I feel like I do have a good rapport with a lot of my students, and I think especially in the math classes, I think students react really well to the way that I approach math, especially the lower level classes where maybe the students are taking a remedial class and maybe they're not maybe they didn't do so well in math in high school and they're kind of retaking again now, or they've been out of school for a while. Maybe they're a working adult who's coming back to school. But I always try to approach the math in a really intuitive way. So one thing that always bothers me when I was learning math is if a teacher just said, well, just follow this algorithm or this process and you'll get the answer, but not really understanding why that process worked. And I think a lot of times when students understand why the process works, they'll find it much more interesting. And they tend to do better in the material as well, and it'll finally click for them. Because I think math is more fun and more interesting when you understand it at that intuitive level, which is something that mathematicians know, because that's the reason we like math. But sometimes we have trouble passing that information down to our students.
And it sounds like you would take a similar approach when you're teaching music, so it's not just all sort of dry theory, but also an appreciation and love of what you're listening to.
Right, absolutely. Because I do teach a little bit of the theory and vocabulary because I'm trying to make sure that they learn some of that. But my overall goal in music class is that the students just become more active listeners. So maybe they're listening to a tune on the radio, and before taking my class, they would very much just passively listen to it and decide, I like that tune, I don't like it. After my class, I'm hoping that they can maybe pick out a few musical elements, like, I noticed that the tempo changed a little bit, and there was a lot of crescendos and decrescendos, the volumes going up and down. They can start to pick out elements in the music that they can think about a little more critically, and they can talk about the music at a little more intellectual level. And I find that a lot of students at the end of the semester, they'll tell me that, like, I heard this song on the radio the other day. I liked it. I wasn't sure why, but now after taking the course, I'm able to like pick out a few elements and talk about how the rhythm was changing, or that it sounded like it was a dissonant piece, and I liked that strange dissonance that was going on. So it's cool to hear them start using that vocabulary. And I always encourage them when they're doing things like answering discussion boards, like, try to use as much of this vocabulary as you can. I'm not trying to make you a music expert, just trying to get you to get in the habit of starting to talk about music in a more meaningful way.
That's fantastic. I've been speaking with Dr. Joe Murfin, who is a professor of mathematics and music at Middlesex Community College, and we have to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll talk with Joe more about his role as a professor here, and also about an exciting Lunch and Learn seminar series that he developed about financial independence. We'll talk about why that's important to Middlesex Community College students and the public, and learn more about the topics that Joe has put together for this Lunch and Learn series. You're listening to Middlesex Moments from Middlesex Community College, coming to you on air at WLIS WMRD Radio and online at mxcc.edu. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
I chose Middlesex Community College because of the location. Everyone's always willing to help, and they all just want you to succeed at the end of the day. Phlebotomy was my major, and what made me choose it was working in a group home and just seeing the pain that they went through. I highly recommend MxCC's continuing education program. This fast-paced course allowed me to get a phlebotomy job in a field that I love.
Welcome back to Middlesex Moments, coming to you from Middlesex Community College. I'm Steve Minkler, together with my guest, Dr. Joe Murfin, who is a professor of mathematics and music here at the college. Before the break, we were talking about Joe's approach to teaching both subjects, which have some overlap, but not fully, as we were discussing. And we were also talking about how Joe has quite a following among his students. And one of the things, Joe, that you've done to inform students about sort of mathematics in everyday life is you created a Lunch and Learn seminar series called the Financial Independence Series. Why did you think that this was important to develop for our students?
Well, it's something that I spend a lot of time studying, so it's kind of personal finance. I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to that stuff, so I spend a lot of time reading and learning about it. And it's information that I really started delving deep into maybe 7 years ago when I was in my late 20s. And it's information that I wish I had when I was 18. I'd be, even in a better situation maybe if I had learned that information then. So I found that I spent a lot of time complaining that we don't teach personal finance in school. So I said, well, why don't I just do something about it? So I just decided to start running these kind of informal Lunch and Learn seminars where students can kind of come in and just learn about some various topics in personal finance. It's really informal because it's not a class, so they don't have to worry about taking tests and things like that. And it allows me to kind of focus on, maybe things that are not so strenuous, like learning how to do different math problems and things like that. Mm-hmm. The students can just learn about the material and not be really stressed about having to regurgitate it later or to have to work some problems going forward.
Right, and you approach this since you just almost as quite out of personal experience, or like you just said, some personal motivation rather than putting yourself out there as a certified financial planner, which you're not. But
Exactly.
This is really,
Yeah, and I always try to make sure that everyone
Right.
knows that. The disclaimer is I'm not, I'm not a financial professional. Just kind of a guy who studies a lot of this stuff and likes to share that information. So I always let the students know if they are going to make some kind of big financial decision, they should consult someone who is professional, just to make sure that all the T's are crossed, I's are dotted, that kind of stuff. But my idea with the seminar is to at least give them a starting point where they have a basic knowledge of information, and then from there they can go out and do some of their own research, find professionals who can help them out.
Okay. So you've selected a series of topics that together comprise this Lunch and Learn seminar series, and maybe let's walk our listeners through the 6 topics that you've selected for this series. Maybe just take it from the top, what you've picked.
Sure, yeah. So I have 6 weeks. The first week I just try to keep it as a basic introduction to what financial independence is. Basically, it's the idea that eventually you have enough money and assets and investments where you don't need to work in order to live your lifestyle. Basically, you don't need to work anymore. If you do that into older age, we call that retirement, of course. But there's also a generation of young people who have figured out that they could do this a little bit quicker. They can maybe retire a little bit early. And that's called the FIRE movement, or the Financial Independence Retire Early movement. So we talk a little bit about that as well. And I just talk about a few basic topics like how much money should you be shooting for to retire according to some studies. There's some ideas like the rule of 72, which is based on an interest rate. How long will it take your money to double? And we just kind of go through a few different various topics. It's just kind of an introduction to financial independence. And then from there, I move into a little bit more practical information. Week 2, I'm doing one on like budgets and tracking your expenses. So we talk a little bit about making a budget, and I show the students a few different pieces of software they can use to actually track what they're spending, which you typically are spending more than you think you are in a certain area. You might think you're spending $500 on groceries, but it turns out you're spending $1,000. So how do you track that? We talk a little bit about debt in terms of how staying out of debt can really help you, really help push you forward in your finances. And if you do have debt, how do you get rid of it quickly? So we talk about a few strategies. And again, these are relatively short. They're only 45 or 50 minutes. So we kind of just hit some of the basic topics, and then the idea is the students can learn a little more from there.
Okay. And do you find that some of the students are totally sort of blown away or shocked by some of this information? As you said, we don't teach personal finance very much or very well, even especially at Middlesex Community College, but also many high schools don't approach the subject too well either.
Well, yeah, because a lot of the math is really non-intuitive because it's exponential growth, which if you talk to a mathematician, they'll tell you that the human brain has trouble comprehending exponential growth. We just don't do it very well. So one of the things I show them that they typically are very floored by is that if you start really young, you actually don't have to save very much money in order to retire with, say, $1 million. Because, for example, if you have the rule of 72 says if you have a certain interest rate, you divide it into 72. That's how long it takes approximately for your money to double. So like a 7% interest rate, your money would double in 10 years. So I show them if they were able to save something like $62,000 by age 25, which seems like a lot of money, and it is, but that would theoretically, at 7% interest, by the time they're 65, would grow to about $1 million. So it's really interesting for them to kind of see that like that little bit of money, even without saving more, can really, really grow if you have the time. You need time on your side, though.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, I think I heard one. It's not really an example of compound interest, but just the fact that you were saying we don't completely grasp exponential growth. I think the riddle is, would you rather take $1 million today or a penny today, and then every day that amount doubles, so go from 1 penny today to 2 cents tomorrow and so forth, and you wind up with some fantastic amount of money at the end of a month, right?
Right, yeah. I actually do that with my class, and I can't remember the actual number off the top of my head, but you get to $1 million with I think maybe a week left over in the month. Yeah, so it goes up a lot faster. Yeah,
exactly.
But like you said, you can't really comprehend that. If you ask someone to guess, they'll guess like, I don't know, a couple $1,000s or something. Right.
So some of the other topics you cover are wealth building, and I guess how exposed have students been to things like, building wealth, accumulating assets, investing in things like mutual funds or 401k or retirement vehicles?
Right. So I kind of cover some basics of stock investing and what mutual funds are and how they relate to stocks, and then index funds, which is a type of mutual fund, and then bonds and real estate investment trusts and CDs. So I think what it is for a lot of the students is this stuff seems really complicated. And a lot of it seems really complicated because it has really complicated names. And I think, you could argue maybe that's part of the strategy of the finance world, because they don't want people doing it on their own, right? Because that's how they make their money. That's maybe just a little bit of a conspiracy theory. But I think that once the students realize that it's not as complicated as they think it is, they realize like, oh, you know what, I could actually learn how to invest on my own, or at least if I do use a financial advisor, I'm a lot more advised. I know a lot more about what's going on, so I can make sure that I get someone who really knows what they're doing. They're not trying to take advantage of me. And the other thing we talk about is the difference between investing and speculation. I try to teach them that investing is for the long term, and it's done with a lot of research and knowledge, versus speculation is when you buy something and just basically hope that it doubles in price at some point, and then you can sell it. And there's a big difference there. And I think a lot of students, they see things like people speculating in the stock market, and then they lose a lot of money, and then they say, oh, well, I should probably just stay away from stocks. It's too risky. But there are more responsible ways to invest your money than simply trying to speculate. And usually that involves thinking long-term, 30, 40 years down the line.
Right. So you began this Financial Independence Lunch and Learn seminar series, I think, in the spring of 2019. And you're continuing it now this current semester, fall of 19. Are you planning on offering it spring of 2020? That's
right. I think I started actually fall of 2018.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so this is the third one. But yes, we are continuing in spring of 2020. We'll be picking it up. Usually I do it the second half of the semester, so probably the end of March, April. That'll be when we're running it.
Okay, and we usually publish those dates on the college's website, which is mxcc.edu. But if somebody wanted to contact you for additional information about these topics or about math classes at Middlesex, how do they get in touch with you?
Sure, they could always email me. My email address is jmurfin, that's jmurfin, at mxcc.comnet.edu. They could always email me and ask me questions about that, and I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, great. And some of this, like you were saying before, it's sort of personal motivation, and you mentioned earlier that you're the father of a 2-year-old daughter.
Yes, yep.
So I'm sure you, in your mind, are planning for your family's financial future and your daughter's future as well.
Yeah, and absolutely. And that's one of the things I like to teach the students, is that if they start planning for this stuff when they're young, not only, it's not so much about being rich, it's about having options as you get older, because as you start a family, maybe your priorities change, and maybe one parent needs to stop working to stay home with a child, or you have someone in your family get sick. And if you haven't thought about the financial side of it, and if you haven't been preparing, it makes it a lot harder to make an adjustment in your life. So the earlier that you start planning this kind of stuff, the more you can make decisions as you get older based on what's best for you and your family, versus making decisions based on your pocketbook and needing the income. And that's something that I really try to emphasize to the students, that you can get wealthy You can get wealthy, of course, if you do the right things with your money, but also you're really buying your freedom, and you're buying flexibility in your life and the ability to make adjustments as you move on in life and get older.
Awesome. And I hope you'll pass that down to your own daughter.
Yes, yeah, that's what I'm planning on. Right now, she's still a little too young to understand compounding and exponential growth, but
there you go.
But I imagine we will be doing lots of money exercises as she gets older.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
So as a relatively new parent, what's been your biggest joy of being a father?
I think it's been seeing just the development of, as a teacher, I like seeing how people learn, of course. So it's been really interesting to see how she takes in the world. She's 2.5, so she's got pretty good communication skills now, and she's starting to be able to repeat a lot of things, and she sees things that are new, and she asks what they are. And I always tell people it's really interesting, because she'll see something that's very like pedestrian to me, and she'll ask, what is that? Like it's something she's never seen before, so she thinks it's really interesting.
Awesome. Well, and hopefully your students at the college almost treat you that way too. Wow, this is interesting in math and music as well.
Right.
So, I want to thank Dr. Joe Murfin, professor of mathematics and music at Middlesex Community College, for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.
And many thanks to our on-air media partners, WLIS and WMRD, and all the good people at that radio station. And thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us for another edition of Middlesex Moments. As always, you're welcome to visit us here in person at our main campus at 100 Training Hill Road in Middletown, or at our Meriden Center located at Platt High School, 220 Coe Avenue, where we offer afternoon and evening classes 4 days a week. And of course, you can visit us online 24/7 at mxcc.edu. On behalf of everybody at Middlesex Community College, I'm Steve Minkler, and we hope to see you again soon.